Dumb babies are different, okay? Dumb babies that went to high school during COVID, went to college during COVID, their full college experience during COVID, yeah, they are different.
I don't think Gen Z is more conservative. I think they're hopeless. I think they spend a majority of their educational career dodging bullets and having drills for a majority of politicians to reduce things down to a debate. There's no promise of buying a home. There's no promise of being financially secure ever.
We were told that we were a generation that was going to save us all as we were being lit in schools. We're a generation that every time we come and talk about the realities of the world we live in, it's met with one of two. Either we're too young, haven't experienced enough life to know what we're talking about, or maybe we need to run for office. And then on top of that, when we have conversations about what needs to be done, nobody can agree.
There's been a divide brewing within Gen Z for almost half a decade now that's gone by largely undetected until now, where the differences could not be clearer. What I'm talking about here is the ideological and political split within our generation that has led to an alleged rise not only in asocial behaviors, but also in regressive and sometimes conservative ideologies and beliefs shared more closely to those in Gen X and Boomers rather than millennials and the older half of Gen Z. Everyone's been talking about the rise of conservatism in Gen Z. I've made a video talking about the rise of conservatism in Gen Z, but now I don't think that it's completely fair to monolith Gen Z in this way, because the data shows that Gen Z does not think the same way, and in fact there is a more coherent split than we may have initially thought. And in this video we're going to try and get to the root of exactly why this is, where this split is coming from, where this ideological departure began, and to discuss whether or not it's still fair to look to younger generations, specifically Gen Z, as being the monolithic symbol for progress anymore. Because as far as I was told, we were supposed to be the future, and we're seeing how that's going. But before we get into all of that, if you are new to the channel, hello, my name is Rumi, nice to meet you. If you like content like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button because we are so close to 300K, and I'd love to have you here when we finally do. You can also show support by leaving a like on this video and follow me on my socials at Imurgency on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where I'd be posting about more lifestyle and other things that aren't as heavy and commentary based. But actually, while we're here and while we're talking about things that affect the lives of everyday people, your sleep, and more specifically, the quality of your sleep. And that's why I'm so happy to talk about this video's sponsor, Helix Sleep. Now, cut the track. I need to say this before we go into the rest of this ad read. I have been so excited to work with this brand for years. When I tell you I've been sleeping on a Helix mattress for years, and before I got that Helix mattress, I have been seeing other YouTubers, specifically ASMR YouTubers, talk about Helix, and I was influenced to buy one. Let's just talk about the full circle moment of it all. But yes, this portion of the video is sponsored by Helix, but we're not here to talk about their lovely mattresses, even though I really could because they are amazing. And it's only gotten stellar reviews from other people that have been in it. But we're here today to talk about one of their other products that I absolutely love. And I want you to know I'm being so serious with this. Like, I've never been more serious for a brand collab. Like, I have been a fan for years. Sorry. But for those of us that don't want to invest in like a full mattress, because let's face it, mattresses are expensive, Helix has you covered because they are now offering their Helix Sleep mattress toppers. Now hold on, when you hear mattress topper, you normally think of something akin to college or like the college years, but I assure you, this is a much more premium experience, okay? The Helix mattress topper is perfect for anyone looking to take their current mattress to the next level. Helix offers 5 different options of mattress toppers to fit your sleep style and sleep goals. Now, if you know me or this channel, you know I would never recommend you something that I haven't personally tried myself. And like I said, I've already been a big fan of this brand, so I felt a little spoiled being able to try out their new mattress topper. And let me tell you something. I've been sleeping on the premium memory foam mattress topper for about a few weeks now, and I kid you not, it has made my sleep even more comfortable than it already was, and I already snoozing. Like super soft and super plush, and I also have other mattress topper options if you like something more firm or something more ergonomic. My favorite thing about the mattress toppers, aside from the comfort, is just the ease of installation. Like literally you just strap the mattress topper over the edges of your bed and you're good to go. So if you are ready to change your sleep for the better, click the link in my description or head to helixsleep.com/emergency to take part in their Memorial Day exclusive partner offer where you can get 27% off site-wide. And that, my friends, is a good deal. Thank you so much, Helix, for sponsoring this section of the video. Let's actually talk about what's going on with the younger Gen Z. So you may be asking, Rumi, what's driving you to say that there is a divide in Gen Z right now? Well, let's look at the data. So what's going on with Gen Z right now? Like I said in the intro, there's been a lot of conversation online about Gen Z moving more and more to the right. And outside of exit polling from the 2024 election, most of this has been like pretty anecdotal. Like there hasn't been a ton of like true statistical research for this. So when we've been talking about this, it's been more of like, yes, the amount of young people that voted voted for Trump in the 2024 election, but also just like the general sentiments with the rise of more conservative leaning trends, regressive ideologies making a return to the zeitgeist, and just the general vibes of it all. And I think that what's changed now is that we actually do have some statistical data here. It's not looking great. According to a new Yale Youth poll, which is a survey affiliated with the Yale Institution for Social and Political Studies, voters 18 to 21 have been revealed to lean Republican by 11.7 points, and when asked who they would support in the 2026 congressional elections, essentially meaning the midterm elections next year, which in and of itself is wild considering everything that we've seen happen over the past 4 months. But interestingly, voters aged 22 to 29 favored Democrats by 6.4 points, really showing a statistical split within Gen Z, or at least the adults of Gen Z. And I think that this split is really interesting and something that we should really talk about, because I don't think that these splits in age groups are just irrelevant. I do think that this age divide does tell a story based on the experiences of young people of Gen Z in these age brackets. And I think this is an important conversation because honestly, like up until last year, Gen Z has been seen in the media as like this overwhelmingly liberal, or at least more so progressive than previous generations generation that believes strongly in things like climate change, equality, human rights, bodily autonomy, and all these things, which has typically made Gen Z lean more heavily to the left. But as we've seen in our culture and in our polling, that is no longer necessarily the monolithic or one truth anymore for Gen Z. You can't solely count on the youth vote anymore because the youth vote is divided. And I really do think that this divide comes down to the difference in life experiences and just cultural experiences from the older and younger half of Gen Z. Now, before we hop in this conversation, let's define what we're talking about when I say older Gen Z and younger Gen Z. There was a really good opinion piece that was later turned into like TikToks where someone coined the term Gen Z 1.0 and Gen Z 2.0, essentially distinguishing the two halves of Gen Z right now. Gen Z 1.0 being the older half of Gen Z. What the distinguishing factor between Gen Z 1.0 and Gen Z 2.0 is how old you were and what life stage you were at in 2020 when the pandemic hit. Well, Gen Z 1.0 being those that were able to experience graduating high school prior to or just at lockdown and up, and Gen Z 2.0 being those that went to high school during the lockdowns and missed out on the things like graduation, prom, or just generally had more of a hybrid school experience. And I think that it's really important that we talk about this academic situation and the impact of this one major life indicator on the entirety of Gen Z and how that's contributed to the split. We underplay a lot about but one thing specifically is the impact that it had on education and how long lasting those effects were and continue to be. We've spoken about the specific impacts of education in previous videos before, talking about things like how younger Gen Z and Gen Alpha are on a reading level and just generally struggle with things like literacy and are falling behind academically in the US, as well as talking about things like how dismantling the Department of Education and attacking education has been and will continue to impact the futures of Gen Alpha and Gen Beta. But just speaking in generalities, things don't look great. No. In 2022, 26% of 8th graders were at or above proficient in math, much worse than before the pandemic, with that being around 33% in 2019. And it's not just math, it is across the board. You can look no farther to TikTok to see teachers and educators alike sounding alarm bells to the state of education, how things just are so bad and so underfunded, and how schools now have essentially become forms of daycare because they have to pass the kids along every single year, despite whether or not they're actually passing their classes or not. So with the combination of education interruptions from the pandemic, the lack of resources given to students, teachers, and schools, and the lack of general care for one's schooling education, as well as political moves being made to dissuade people from getting higher levels of education, like with all the things going on with student loans being collected, it really sets the stage for what we're seeing and what we're going to see, with groups of people growing into adults in society without the same or similar level of education or experience, as seen in times past. And this isn't me saying like, oh, not being educated makes you automatically conservative. Like, no. What I'm trying to do is paint a picture for what the major differences are between the older and younger halves of Gen Z and what their experiences are like. Although I will say that looking at voting trends and demographics, with those without higher education or just general uneducated communities do tend to vote more conservatively, just looking at voting records. But I bring this up because just one, I think that it's genuinely concerning and will continue to make a clear disconnect from Gen Z just from the sake of quality of education for at least 10 years worth of students just not getting the education that they deserve or need. And not saying that the state of education prior to the pandemic was great either, like it was still trash, but it's the fact that it's worse than trash now. is the problem. And this isn't even talking about Gen Alpha. Like the widespread lack of literacy, critical comprehension, and thinking that is generally taught in schools makes things like manipulation and mis and disinformation easier to spread and propagate because it's more likely to be taken at face value or immediately believed to be true without taking a critical lens to the things that you're hearing or consuming, or even when evidence points to the opposite. But this whole point isn't just to talk about like, oh wow, education sucks. It's more so to highlight that like younger Gen Z came into a system that really just was not secure or safe. Like the younger half of Gen Z experienced things like middle school, high school, and even college where things were shown to not matter. Like having school be completely remote, like having classes and workloads that were either non-existent or a joke, or classes that were entirely too difficult despite everything else that was going on in the world showing that like this doesn't matter, leaves the impression that like, yeah, school doesn't really matter. School isn't something that's necessarily, for one, safe or sacred even when it is in person. And for a select group of people in that 18 to 22-year-old bracket, they didn't necessarily experience the same life events or see the same life events take place as those of us in the older half of Gen Z. Like think of things like graduations or proms or just other socialized events that take place during that time. They didn't have that security or that stable grounding. So it makes sense. I'm not saying that it's right, but it's understandable why having those experiences and not feeling a sense of stability or something concrete to look to, that you would turn to more conservative ideals that prop themselves up to be things that are more set in stone, more standardized, more like this is how things are always done and this is how we're always going to do them, whether or not that actually becomes true in practice or not. It's why I'd argue that we're seeing a lot more of a push towards traditionalism, traditional values, trad wives, traditional gender roles, and stereotypes, because those are things that have been tried and true, tested to quote unquote work and provide that stability that we all saw in media from our parents' generations or the generations before that. However, times are different, and the reason that the traditional lifestyle doesn't necessarily work in practice for a lot of people is because the world is different. The price of things is different, and it's a lot harder and a lot more expensive to have and live in a traditional lifestyle in untraditional and unprecedented times. Like, I don't know, but I think I'm getting ahead of myself here because I think that there's another sub reason that contributes to that. And that's just the general rise in distrust of authority, of systems, of people, and the rise in things like conspiracy theories. Surveys show that there is a significant erosion of trust among Gen Z in the major US institutions, whether that be specifically in politics, whether it be the courts, whether it be science, whether that be the police, like any of the powers that be, there is a widespread distrust or a growing distrust in these institutions. And honestly, real. Fewer than 1 in 4 Gen Z members trust the information they find on the internet, the US Supreme Court, and the criminal justice system, with science having the most trust at around 71%, which, yay, period. Love that we believe science. But it makes sense why we would have a growing distrust of the systems around us, because a lot of times they lie. And if they're not lying, they're not actively working in the interest of younger people or the general public. There seems to be a wider spread of skepticism and general disillusionment with the traditional structures at hand and the authorities that uphold those structures. And you could argue that in the case of young people as a whole, the traditional structure for young people, or at least the structure in which Gen Z was brought up and socialized in, was like, we're gonna be the generation for progressive change. It's expected for us to overwhelmingly be more to the left, to be more progressive, to vote more democratic. So as we're seeing this push towards a counterculture or rejection of the traditional structures and systems at B, for the younger half of us, that very well could mean going to the other party, going to the other side. So we've talked about some of the reasons why the younger half of Gen Z has moved the way that it does. We're going to get back there. But I think it's also important to talk about like why there's a split in general and why it seems that the older half of Gen Z is still more so leaning to the left. And for this, I'll quote an opinion article from the Washington Post. The older Zoomers still maintain some of that 2016 era perspective, even if they frequently sound exhausted, in my experience, by many of the same issues facing the broader electorate: inflation, sky-high cost of rent in the job market. The protest movements of my college years felt like a rebellion against the older establishment, racism and indifference to young lives that had gone on for far too long. For Gen Z 2.0, the perspective was flipped, and the prevalent status quo was a walking on eggshells culture shaped by the shared activist gains of Gen Z 1.0 and millennials. It didn't help that the same progressive circles they associated with these causes were also linked in the public eye with things like elections and slower school reopenings. So I'd agree for Gen Z 1.0. A lot of us grew up in the era where we had been seeing a lot of social change, and especially where young people had been at the forefront of that social change. I think Greta Thunberg, the survivors of the Parkland then went on to become activists, advocating for things like And like there were still definitely very big blaring issues, as there always have been, it just seemed that like Gen Z and the younger generation was down to sort of fight those head on and to be the agent of change and progress to move them to a better place. Whereas Gen Z 2.0, as the author puts it, grew up in turmoil in a world where everything seemed broken: the K-12 education system, social interactions, the economy, and traditional institutions. They didn't really have the spaces to necessarily come together as peers or to have like normal social interactions and to have those developmental stages like flirting and courtship in real life, or like having and maintaining friendships in real life as like a teenager and as like a young adult. And we're gonna put a pin on that because I'm gonna talk about that point specifically in just a second when we talk about our next point. But all that juxtaposed against the fact that like the younger half of Gen Z was brought up and became aware of the world in a way that was inherently anti-progressiveness, with a lot of the issues going on in the country and the world that had to do with things that directly impacted all of our lives, like schooling, health, and returning back to a sense of normalcy, being blamed by either side and politicized, essentially leading people in that group vulnerable to the lovely alt-right pipeline. And we're gonna come back to that pin that I put in, the whole dating and flirting of it all, because I talked about this a little bit on live, but I do think that it's really interesting that when we think about this divide, that we mention how different those formative experiences of like socialization are in between Gen Z, and especially for the generations like the older part of Gen Alpha as we see them grow up, because socialization just looks so night and day different for these groups. Like we see all the time with teachers telling us that like it seems that like the kids in high school, and that being like the younger half of Gen Z, are a lot meaner, a lot more misogynistic, a lot less empathetic. And when we see these things, we have to think like, okay, these people are lacking one, the foundational experience of like socialization, and especially when it comes to things like talking to people and flirting with people. For a lot of these people in formative years, especially the people that were in high school during things like lockdown, everyone was really siloed off. And even after the lockdowns, people continue to be more and more isolated. Like we see everything with like the loneliness epidemic. Like people generally are to themselves and in their bubbles more. So when people are in these bubbles and in their own spaces, they one, don't have the experience to know how to go through these things and have these interactions in a healthy or seemingly normal way. And the examples that are given, the examples that are popular, are from people like influencers, streamers, the self-help gurus that try and help you win the girl or get the guy to notice you, that are all gateways to the alt-right pipeline. And that leads me to the next section of the video where we're talking about the impact of these influencers. And honestly, the fault of some of these influencers for influencing and swaying things this way. But I think that a good portion of it is that our generation, and specifically the younger half of our generation, has all of this information and has all these ways of flirting and their own ideas of like what's desirable and how to talk and flirt to people in whatever way they've been seeing fit online, but don't really have the avenues to put that in practice for real. Because I think toxic dating content like the alt-right pipeline, the alt-right adjacent dating advice videos have always been a thing. Like that, as long as the internet's been around, there's always been like the alpha male strategy videos, the funk and foot adjacent and clones. But I think, and this is more so headcanon and conjecture rather than like actually research based, but like the difference is like prior to lockdowns and stuff, you'd see that kind of content and people would try it out and they would see exactly how ill-received that is in the real world and how a lot of that advice does not really hold up in the real world, and in fact makes you very misogynistic, makes you a pick-me, makes you undesirable in real circles, not just the ones online. And then you course correct, change your behavior, and act accordingly. But I feel like that aspect of it, of the actual interaction, and like having these things play out in real life, is not happening and has not happened to the same degree. So a lot of people are just like running off it. They think that these things that they're hearing online work and aren't getting the real life feedback that they do or don't. That's why we see so much either freaked out content or like extremely misogynistic content online that people just think would work in real life, but it actually doesn't. Like that makes you a weird person. Like doing the things and saying some of the things that y'all say online in real life will get you some real consequences. It's not gonna pan out the way that it does online. Now let's talk about the influencer of it all, because this kind of spirals into a larger conversation about the role that influencers specifically had during the election last year, but also sort of the flip-flopping that has gone on since then, showing that this was definitely just like a grift, and now that the things that the person they got people to vote for is doing is actually impacting them, be it things like tariffs and student loans and whatever, what have you, people are switching up, showing that like, yeah, this was all either for money, for engagement, or just to be controversial. And it really makes me and many other wonder, like, are y'all regretting your choice right now? Like over the past couple months or so, we're now witnessing a lot of voter regret. Especially most on display is influencer voter regret from the people who were on the front lines platforming and sort of campaigning for Trump because they thought that they would be unscathed for some reason. But now that things are starting to affect their bottom dollar, we're switching things up. And it's seeming like it's almost as if they cared about the rights of everybody else. Any point in time, we could have avoided this, but you know, here we are. Now I mentioned before, like, the red pill pipeline adjacent influencers and content that were really prevalent during the 2020s. We want to talk specifically about the youth vote and the monolith that had previously been thought of as Gen Z being the Democratic voting base. We saw a really big social campaign push for this from the Republican side on social media last year. And what I think is important is that social media is clearly the main way to engage young people in politics. But unlike TV campaign commercials or sponsored messages on traditional forms of media, influencers don't necessarily need to disclose if they're being approached by, paid by, sponsored by a certain party in order to endorse them, which means that some people may be advocating for a certain party because they really feel passionate about it or because they're being cut a check. And there's honestly no way to really know unless the influencers themselves come forward and be like, hey, yeah, this is a sponsored message by, or I was paid by. And I guess now we can kind of tell based on who's been backtracking, expressing regret in their decision, because either that check's drying out or you see that your future check is. And to be clear, both the Democratic and Republican parties and their affiliates approached influencers last year for paid endorsement, collaboration, appearances, whatever, what have you. But also, to be fair, only one of them was running on a Project 2025 campaign and actually advertised a man who I thought we all hated 4 years ago. Just repurposed, but more extreme this time. I don't know. And to back this up, a very reputable source, Tana Mojo, a YouTuber with more than 5 million subscribers, suggested during an episode of her podcast that she was offered millions to endorse an unnamed political party on social media. And to be clear, she'd already publicly backed Harris, implying that the offer came from another party, but she vaguely indicated that she turned down the money, and she was being allegedly told an alleged list of other influencers that had already hypothetically accepted money to do those hypothetical things, she said. Though, according to CNN, spokespeople from her camp did not reply to CNN's request for an interview. Now, I was joking before when I said that Tana Mojo was a reliable source. Not saying that she's Drew, but she did speak on this on her podcast, so that's something to take with a grain of salt. And while a lot of influencers and creators over the past month have been backpedaling and expressing their regret in their decisions to endorse Trump, it's important to look at how impactful these facilitators of indoctrination for AdSense are and who their demographics are, specifically how this has all contributed to the split between Gen Z. And this is going to be a specific look at people with huge platforms with the tangible ability to influence and engage communities. And for this, I'm looking at people like Joe Rogan, and the likes, who majorly profited off of platforming Trump, if not from an alleged endorsement check, definitely from the clicks and engagement. So let's start off with Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is the name that we all know, but wish we didn't. He is a podcaster, and I'm not sure if right now it is still so. I think he is like the largest podcast, if not in the top 3 largest podcasts on Spotify. And his podcast kind of talks a little bit about everything. It's definitely a right-leaning show and has like those alt-right bro-y vibes that also have had a record of spreading misinformation, especially about things like rhetoric, and of course has the inclusion of things like slurs, at least as recently as 2022. And truly, I don't think I could tell you much more than that because I have not fully listened to a podcast, nor do I necessarily want to. Anyways, Rogan was not one of those on the fence people, like can be convinced either way, like centrist types like Theo Vaughn. He just outright went and supported Trump and even had him on the podcast for 3 hours prior to the election. And at the time of the study we're about to talk about, in October 2024, this is how Joe Rogan's listeners fell in terms of voting and politics. And I want you to keep in mind the demographics here of who's listening. So, according here, his demographics are about 80% male, 51% aged 18 to 34, 34% independent or something else, 32% Republicans, 27% Democrats, and 21% Hispanic or Latino. And again, you can kind of tie this back to my old like Gen Z men being more conservative video and looking at the voting records for those demographics as well in the last election. And if you look at the data from this Edison Podcast Metrics survey, you can see that listeners in November of 2024 definitely have a pro-Trump swing. But what's interesting about Rogan's case specifically is that, like, while he is a very controversial figure, in 2022, he looked at things a little differently. The controversial podcast host says that he's not a Trump supporter and refuses to support Trump by having him on the show. The Trump era is also going to be one of the weirder times. Rogan said, when people look back historically about the division in this country, he's such a polarizing figure that so many people felt like they could just abandon their own ethics and morals and principles just to attack him and anybody who supports him because he's an existential threat to democracy itself. He added that he is not a Trump supporter in any way, shape, or form. He's had the opportunity to have him on his show more than once. I've said no every time. I don't want to help him. I'm not interested in helping him. Which, of course, everyone's entitled to change their opinions at any point in their life. But it just shows how far the times have changed. And though everyone has the ability to change their opinions, it's not as if he got substantially better from 2022 to 2024. Like, he just got worse. The platform that he was going on about in 2022 did not improve at any point, or did not get better for many people. I mean, maybe him for like the tax benefits, I don't know, in 2024. But that also reminds me of how Joe Rogan is kind of at odds with Trump right now, because he doesn't agree with the case that has been coming from him. And I'm sure he, like the rest of us, wasn't too happy about the tariff situation and the stock market crash. Now, this whole video isn't to talk about Joe Rogan. It's more so an example of influencers who are on the grift, who are in it not necessarily because they 100% believe it, but because it's divisive, can get attention, and there is benefit from it, which unfortunately does have an impact on the audiences viewing it, specifically younger audiences viewing it. Because again, if this is content that's popular, this is the content that people are seeing and resonating with and believing in without any form of necessarily rebuttal or real life application or example of these things being upheld, it's no surprise that we've been seeing such a stark divide within the younger and older halves of Gen Z. And with all that said, I think it's important right now to really take stock of like where we are as a generation and where we're planning to go, because it seems that there is definitely a disconnect here. And while we can understand why things are the way they are, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's how we need to keep them and where they need to always be. Again, I'm not here, and the point of my videos isn't to necessarily make you feel a certain way or to believe a certain way. It is just to provide perspective and to start a conversation. But we really need to start talking. Like, what's the goal here? Because if the goal is to bridge the disconnect here, a lot of things need to change. We're seeing in real time how these structures and institutions that be are essentially making it easier and easier to fall down these pipelines and to not have our needs be met. And I think as a generation, it's important that we are at least looking out and keeping our ears and minds open to what's going on and what's affecting us as young people, because it's clear that shit isn't working, and how people are dealing with that and coping with that, and the places that we are gravitating to are more different than we initially thought. But yeah, I think I'm gonna leave the video off here, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think about this? Do you feel like there is a cultural or ideological divide between Gen Z? And if you do, if you don't, what do you think the reasons are? I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. Again, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and follow me on my social medias at Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Imurgency. Thanks so much again, Helix, for sponsoring this video. And don't forget to head to helixsleep.com/Imurgency to take part in the Memorial Day exclusive partner sale and get 27% off site-wide. But other than that, y'all, I've been Imurgency, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.